Too far. Hi. Hi. It's you smacking your chops. Happy Friday. It's February 3rd. February. One of those words that is not pronounced the way that it's spelled. At least not anymore. I wonder if it was at some point more February. I feel like if you're pronouncing it normally, you really enunciate the U too. Like, it's really February. Like, really need to let people know that I'm skipping that first R. February is a weird month. Why does February get the short February? February. Why does February get the short days? It really had more R's. February. February. Hi, Sharkies. Nice. Cool. How was your Friday treating you? Your Friday in this fine February. February. Well, strong start. Doing all right. You can complain if you want to. You can. You're allowed. We've had a busy week. We had 3 house showings between Wednesday and Thursday. So we've got 2 possibilities for our first bingo now. Right, I said I was going to go back to Silk being very sarcastic. If it came up, it would have been in the first chapter of part 2. The thing that we were thinking of. Or part 3. Part 3. We're in part 3. Silk stole the money from Barak. Made some delicious dip with sour cream and leftover green mint sauce. That does sound tasty. Just kind of scanning through everything that Silk said in that chapter. What are you doing down there, Ben? You looking for crumbs? He was real, like, salty about having to go into the fens. Oh. You caught a bot while I wasn't even looking. Wants to offer a promotion. Thank you for catching that. I guess the end of the chapter, he said, "Delightful, how wonderful to be home again in dear old mucky Drasnia." But other than that, I didn't spot anything that really stood out as sarcasm, just him being real salty about having to go into the fens. So I'm going to hold off on that for now. I'm going to say we have not yet got our bingo. That'll make it more exciting later anyways. So, we read 2 chapters on Wednesday, 18 and 19, and those were pretty interesting. We had the whole story of Vordai that we got through. Vordai and the Fenlings. That was fun. And now this world has talking otters. I can't think of them as anything other than otters. The way they're described. Didn't particularly talk about them eating like shellfish or juggling rocks or anything, but it did talk about them holding hands, which is a thing that otters do. What hath he wrought on the world, Belgarath? No, it's just cute. I don't remember anything else really coming up about the Fenlings in this book, which is a little sad because I would love to see people's like outsiders' first encounters with talking Fenlings. You know, I want to see 20 years down the road what Fenling society looks like. Emmett Otter's Christmas. Oh, I've never heard of it. I mean, it makes me think of the Redwall novels by Brian Jacques a little bit. They're wearing top hats. Well, I'm sure there must be otters in Redwall somewhere. I know it's mostly smaller creatures, but there are like rabbits and hares and I guess more specifically hares than rabbits, I think, and weasels. Pretty sure there was a weasel or a stoat or something. There's moles and mice, lots and lots of mice. I think primarily mice. Have you ever read a Redwall book? I really enjoyed those when I was younger. I think hares are probably as big as otters. I suppose it depends. Some can be. Are there multiple types of hares? I assume there are. If there's an otter in Wind in the Willows. I'm sure I either read or had Wind in the Willows read to me when I was very young. But I don't remember very much of it except for some of the artwork. Neither of you has read a Redwall book yet. I feel like the Redwall are a very nice sort of young adult reading. They're fun. The author was very descriptive about certain things, like the feasts in those books. He was very descriptive, and apparently that's because he was originally, or prior to writing, or maybe while he was writing the first few books, he was a janitor at a school that had some blind kids, I believe. And so he wanted apparently to be very descriptive in the way, like in the way that some of the nice things looked and things like that. So that it would be, a nicer experience for the blind kids. Tamora Pierce. What of Tamora Pierce's have I read? I've definitely read some of Tamora Pierce's writing, but I don't remember off the top of my head what it was. I need to look at a list of books to figure out what I had read. I think I've heard of Alana, but I don't think I've read them. But yeah, I would recommend Redwall as a good series to read, you know, especially with kids. I do remember, because I was fairly young, like I think I was maybe still in elementary school while I was reading some of the Redwall books, and I do remember the first time some like actual violence came up. Like that, I'm pretty sure I read some books where there wasn't very much of like a real villain, but the first time there was sort of a real villain that came up in the Redwall books, I think like a character got like stabbed or something, and I remember being shocked by it because the books had been so like non-violent really up until that point, and then suddenly it was like, oh, like, are you allowed to write about things like that? I don't know. I was pretty young at the time, and I just remember really being surprised. The initial series. Oh. Maybe, like, it's possible I haven't read any Tamora Pierce, and I've just heard the name enough times that I assumed that I had, but I would need to check. The Most Guard I've heard about Most Guard. Have they recently... Do they have a role-playing system? I'm pretty sure there's a Most Guard, like, tabletop RPG. I think maybe Penny Arcade guys are playing with that right now. Yeah, I've heard of Mouse Guard, and I think maybe Mouse Guard might be somewhat inspired by Redwall. I think Redwall is, I don't know, it's a pretty influential series, I think. You bought it. Oh, nice. I feel like I've heard good things about that system, about the Mouse Guard system. I don't think I've heard anything negative about it, anyways. Anyways, yeah, so Vordai, Fenlings, and Two-Pick slipping a frog into Silk's pocket at some point. Whether it was a gift or a prank, we do not know. Seems very different. I don't know much about the specifics. It's nice to take a break from D&D and try out other systems, though. I really like Exalted. I'm sure I must have talked about that at some point, but Exalted's interesting because it only uses D10s. You don't use any other dice, but it uses buckets of D10s, especially as you get stronger. Sometimes you're rolling like 40 D10s. Possibly more, depending on how you're boosting things with your excellencies and that. Get these these abilities that are called excellencies that just basically allow you to pour your like mana into just adding more dice to a roll. All the dice hoarding would pay off. Yeah, I've specifically bought just more D10s just for Exalted. Because it just uses lots of them. And we've played... What other systems? I've played in a fair amount of other systems, but sometimes I've only played with a system like once or twice. Like there's a Traveler system, which is more science fiction. Like you've got a spaceship and, you know, you're visiting other planets, and we were, you know, all alien races and things. And that system was interesting because the character creation itself, like when you're making your character, it's a little bit narrative. And I think that if you got really unlucky, it was like possible for your character to just die during character creation. And I was like, well, we're starting over. Oh yeah, Numenera was really fun. I wanted to play more of that, but we just never got around to it. That was an interesting system. Heroes, yeah. Oh yeah, Heroes Unlimited. Palladium's like Rifts system. We played a fair amount of that. We played that a few times. The My Little Pony RPG. That's a fandom that I have never really personally been involved in, but I know lots of people that are. Mostly uses D4s and D6s with the possibility of using higher ones. And we played in this one system once that was very, like, you wouldn't want to do much more than a one-shot type of game in it. It was not a system that would have been good for, like, a long-term campaign. But it was like you had certain key points about your character, like big descriptive things about your personal character. For instance, I had a character that was like sort of a swashbuckler, and he had a big floppy hat. And when you were describing the action that you're taking, you get a bonus to your action if you manage to include those descriptive things about your character in what you're doing. Yeah, Paranoia we played, but that's not the one I'm describing, of course. But like if I'm trying to think of the way that comes up. That's true. There's so many systems I want to play, but I really need a group of people that like just get together frequently just to play games, like tabletop games. Because I'm not a big fan of playing games online, like playing tabletop games online. It's just not how I prefer to experience those games, so I don't know. Okay, yeah. So 2 days later, in clearing weather, they reached Boktor. So they are fully out of the fens at this point and have made their way to Boktor at the very end of chapter 19. So Boktor, as we can see, is kind of at the center of like a little. It looks like it's an island in the middle of like 3 rivers. I guess I don't know that there's one on this side of it, so maybe it's just in between the forking branches of the river, only on 2 sides. It must be, yeah, probably that way. But at the same time, I really want to play in or run or participate in some way in a D&D game that goes from low levels all the way up to level 20. Because I'm sure I've talked about this before, but like I've been in games that have gone from like level 1 or 2 up to like level 12 or 13, maybe even like 14 once, but I don't think I've ever played in a game that's gone beyond that. And I'm not a huge fan of starting at high levels, because I know some people do that. They'll start at like level 15, which I guess there's an appeal to it, but I really like the development of a character from low levels through to higher levels. Like I like seeing the origins of a character rather than starting out as a character who has already been adventuring for years and years. So, but it's such a like. I feel like it's such an uncommon thing. Like Wizards of the Coast doesn't even really publish adventures that go beyond like level 13. That's what I've heard, yeah, as something in that range. But it's just like it's so weird because I feel like when I look in a book at these characters, right? You know, they've got all or these classes. They've got all these like abilities that go all the way to level 20, and you look at the stuff at level 20 and you go, "Wow, look at this." You know, the character gets to do this and this when they get to level 20. Like, look at the capstones. And yet, I don't know if I know anyone who's ever played a level 20 character. So it's just so like, that's a nice thing that basically might as well not exist. It's such an odd thing to me that it's like, it's just like it's nice in theory, but I don't even know anyone that's actually played that much. And I feel like I know, like I've played quite a lot of D&D, you know, not as much as some people. Like I'm not really in any active games right at the moment. I need to get my Curse of Strahd game back up and running, but it's so hard when we're selling our house. Um, but I know lots and lots of people that just play a lot of games, and it's like, who actually ever plays beyond level like 12? It's so rare. Which is just a little odd, I feel like. Okay, I'm going to read some of this book. We're on chapter 20. 20. 20. In my copy, it's page 179. And we've reached a new city for the first time in quite a while. When was the last time I guess like Riva. We went to Riva, and then prior to getting to Riva, the last like new city that they visited. Do you count Cthul Murgos? Because other than that, it was probably like, oh, I guess the Stronghold. They went to the Stronghold. So it was the Stronghold and then Riva. It feels like it's been a little while since we were somewhere new. So let's hear about Boktor, shall we? If we actually even spend any time there. Ready? There was an open quality about Boktor that Garion noticed immediately as they rode through its broad streets. The houses were not, for the most part, over 2 stories high, and they were not jammed up against each other as they were in other cities he had seen. The avenues were wide and straight, and there was a minimum of litter in them. You know, not how I would have guessed Boktor was going to be up in Drasnia. Especially the way it looks on the map. It's like it's stuck between those 2 rivers. I would have expected it to be more cramped. Cities don't seem as common in this world. Yeah, our heroes spend a lot of time in the wild, it seems like. Not a heavily populated world. So, the avenues were wide and straight, and there was a minimum of litter in them. Here's our explanation. He commented on that as they rode along a spacious, tree-lined boulevard. Boktor's a new city, Silk explained. At least, relatively. Okay. I thought that it's been here since the time of Draz Bulnek. Oh, it has, Silk replied. But the old city was destroyed by the Angarax when they invaded, 500 years ago. I'd forgotten that, Garion admitted. After Vomimbre, when the time came to rebuild, it was decided to take advantage of the chance to start over, Silk continued. He looked about rather distastefully. I don't really like Boktor, he said. There aren't enough alleys and back streets. It's almost impossible to move around without being seen. He turned to Belgarath. That reminds me of something, by the way. It probably wouldn't be a bad idea to avoid the central marketplace. I'm rather well known here, and there's no point in letting the whole city know we've arrived. Do you think we'll be able to slip through unnoticed? Garion asked him. In Boktor? Silk laughed. Of course not. We've already been identified a 6 times. Spying is a major industry here. Poren knew we were coming before we'd even entered the city. He glanced up at a 2nd-floor window, and his fingers flickered a quick rebuke in the gestures of the Drasnian secret language. The curtain at the window gave a guilty little twitch. Just too clumsy, he observed with profound disapproval. Must be a first-year student at the academy. It's been a while since we've seen the Drasnian secret tongue as well, the secret language. A rebuke in the gestures. I censored that there. Can picture what that would be. Windy outside, yeah, heckin' windy and rainy too. You can hear it hitting the skylight. Must be a first-year student at the academy. Probably nervous about seeing a celebrity, Belgarath suggested. You are, after all, something of a legend, Silk. There's still no excuse for sloppy work, Silk said. If I had time, I'd stop by the academy and have a talk with the headmaster about it. He sighed. The quality of student work has definitely gone downhill since they discontinued the use of the whipping post. The what? Garion exclaimed. In my day, a student who was seen by the person he was assigned to watch was flogged, Silk told him. Flogging's a very effective teaching technique, Garion. Hi, puppy. Rice cakes are a very effective puppy technique. More? In my day, yeah. I wonder how old Silk is supposed to be. Because I picture him as relatively young, but I don't know. I wonder if he's supposed to be like in his 30s, or he probably had to cross the fens uphill both ways. So many hills in the fens. Just ahead of them, a door to a large house opened, and a dozen uniformed pikemen marched out into the street, halted, and turned to face them. Well, the officer in charge came forward and bowed politely. Prince Kildar, he greeted Silk. Her Highness wonders if you'd be so good as to stop by the palace. You see, Silk said to Garion, I told you she knew we were here. He turned to the officer. Just out of curiosity, Captain, what would you do if I told you that we didn't feel like being so good as to stop by the palace? I'd probably have to insist, the captain replied. I rather thought you might feel that way about it. Are we under arrest? Garion asked nervously. Garion really has not absorbed this whole he's the king of kings thing that's taken place. Like, he was so nervous about the servants scheduling out his whole life back in Riva that he just started hiding from them, where it's like, have you considered you could just say, I'm the king and I'm going to take a day off? Like, no appointments today. That's an order. King. Super king. And apparently this guard does in fact know who Garion is, because... Are we under arrest? Garion asked nervously. Not precisely, Your Majesty, the captain answered. Queen Porenne most definitely wishes to speak with you, however. He bowed then to Belgarath. Ancient One, he greeted the old man respectfully. I think that if we went around to the side entrance, we'd attract less attention. And he turned and gave his men the order to march. He knows who we are, Garion muttered to Silk. Naturally, Silk said. How are we going to get out of this? Won't Queen Porenne just ship us all back to Riva? We'll talk to her, Belgarath said. Porenne's got good sense. I'm sure we can explain this to her. Unless Polgara's been issuing ultimatums, Silk added. She does that when she gets angry, I've noticed. We'll see. Queen Porenne was even more radiantly lovely than ever. Her slimness made it obvious that the birth of her first child had already occurred. Motherhood had brought a glow to her face, and a look of completion to her eyes. She greeted them fondly as they entered the palace, and led them immediately to her private quarters. The little queen's rooms were somehow lacy and feminine, with ruffles on the furniture. Were somehow lacy and feminine. I was expecting it to say as well as something else, but it doesn't. They were just somehow lacy and feminine with ruffles on the furniture and soft pink curtains at the windows. Maybe if that were somewhat, but somehow feels weird to me. Like it's a mystery how they are lacy and feminine with ruffles on the curtains and pink, or ruffles on the furniture and pink curtains at the windows. I don't know. Anyways. "Where have you been?" she asked them as soon as they were alone. "Polgara's frantic." Belgarath shrugged.
"She'll recover. What's happening in Riva?"
"They're directing the search for you, naturally," Poren replied. "How did you manage to get this far? Every road's been blocked." "We were ahead of everybody, Auntie dearest." Silk grinned impudently at her. "By the time they started blocking roads, we'd already gone through." "I've asked you not to call me that, Keldar," she admonished him. "Forgive me, your highness," he said with a bow, though still grinning mockingly. "You're impossible," she told him. "Of course I am," he answered. "It's part of my charm." The Queen sighed. "What am I going to do with all of you now?"
"You're going to let us continue our journey,"
Belgarath replied calmly.
"We'll argue about it, of course, but in the end, that's the way it'll turn out."
She stared at him.
"You did ask, after all. I'm sure you feel better now that you know."
I feel like that phrasing has come up before. The like, how are we supposed to deal with this? And then, well, what's going to happen is what you don't want. Although the "I'm sure you feel better now that you know" is a pretty good line. "You're as bad or worse than Keldar," she accused.
"I've had more practice."
"It's quite out of the question," she told him firmly. "I have strict orders from Polgara to send you all back to Riva." Belgarath shrugged. "You'll go?" She seemed surprised.
"No," he
replied.
"We won't. You said that Polgara gave you strict orders to send us back. All right, then. I give you strict orders not to. Now where does that leave us?"
"That's cruel, Belgarath."
"Times are hard."
Get Garion in on this. Super King! "Before we get down to serious squabbling, do you suppose we might have a look at the heir to the throne?" Silk asked. His question was artful. No new mother could resist the opportunity to show off her infant, and Queen Poren had already turned toward the cradle standing in the corner of the room before she realized that she was being cleverly manipulated. "You're bad, Keldar," she said reprovingly, but she nonetheless pulled back the satin coverlet to reveal the baby that had become the absolute center of her life. The Crown Prince of Drasnia was very seriously attempting to put one of his toes in his mouth. With a happy little cry, Poren caught him up in her arms and hugged him. "Ta-da, baby!" Then she turned him and held him out for them to see. "Isn't he beautiful?" she demanded. "Hail, cousin!" Silk greeted the baby gravely. "Your timely arrival has ensured that I will be spared the ultimate indignity." "What's that supposed to mean?" Poren asked him suspiciously. "Only that His Little Pink Highness has permanently removed any possibility of my ever ascending the throne," Silk replied. "I'd be a very bad king, Poren.
Drasnia would suffer almost as much as I would if that disaster ever took place. Our Garion here is already a better king by accident than I could ever be.
Oh dear. Porén flushed slightly. That completely slipped my mind. She curtsied somewhat awkwardly, her baby still in her arms. Your Majesty, she greeted Garion formally. Your Highness, Garion answered with the bow Aunt Pole had made him practice for hours. Porén laughed her silvery little laugh. That all seems so inappropriate. She put one hand to the back of Garion's neck, drew his head down, and kissed him warmly. The baby in her other arm cooed. Dear Garion, she said, you've grown so tall. There wasn't much he could say to that. I understand what you're saying. I think that depends on the person, though. Like, for some people, that's how it is, right? Like, even I think some people that wouldn't expect it to be the case, but it's just, it's such a huge thing. But I understand, like, it sounds like she wasn't complete before until she had a baby, and now she's, like, served her purpose or whatever. But I get that, like, for some people, it's really a very important thing. Like, some people focus their whole lives on, wanting to have kids. If it had been, like, Sinedra that this was talking about, I would be like, that doesn't match her personality at all. This is weird. And I suppose... Well, yeah, and if they were phrased in such a way that it were implying that this is the case for every woman, then I'd be like, oh, that's off. I mean, I definitely don't think it's... I think you're taking it to a bit of an extreme. It is definitely not... Porén no longer has any defining features except for Mom. She's being still described as quite clever and nice, and her silvery laugh and whatnot. But like, what did it actually say? It said, like, her face had softened a bit. She was more lovely, and she had a look of completion to her eyes. And I mean, the last time we saw, was she the one that was asking for advice about having kids from Queen Layla? So it was obviously important to her. And I mean, another layer to this is that she is a queen, and so in this sort of setting, it is an important job for a queen to have kids. Which sounds terrible, but I mean, like, the dynasty is an important thing to people. Okay, let's see. You've grown so tall, there wasn't much he could say to that. The Queen studied his face for a moment. Many things have happened to you, she observed shrewdly. You're not the same boy I knew in Val Alorn.
He's making progress,
Belgarath agreed, settling himself into a chair.
How many spies are listening to us at the moment, Porén?
2 that I know of, she replied, returning her baby to his cradle. Silk laughed. And how many spies are spying on the spies? Several, I'd imagine, Poren told him. If I tried to unravel all the spying that goes on here, I'd never get anything done.
I'll assume that they're all discreet,
Belgarath said with a meaningful glance around at the walls and draperies. Of course they are, Poren declared, sounding slightly offended. We do have standards, you know. Amateurs are never allowed to spy inside the palace. Drasnia is weird.
All right, then. All right, let's get down to business then. Is it really going to be necessary for us to go through some long, involved argument about whether or not you're going to try to send us back to Riva?
She sighed and then gave a helpless little laugh. I suppose not, she surrendered. You are going to have to give me an excuse to give to Polgara, though.
Just tell her that we're acting on the instructions contained in the Mrin Codex.
Are there instructions in the Mrin Codex? She sounded surprised.
There might be,
he replied.
Most of it such unmitigated gibberish that no one can be absolutely sure one way or the other.
Are you asking me to try to deceive her?
No, I'm asking you to let her think that I deceived you. There's a difference.
A very subtle one, Belgarath.
It'll be all right,
he assured her.
She's always ready to believe the worst about me. Anyway, the three of us are on our way to Gar Og Nadrak. Get word to Polgara that we're going to need a diversion of sorts. Tell her that I said to stop wasting time looking for us and to mass an army somewhere in the south. Make a lot of noise. I want the Angarax all to be so busy watching her that they don't have time to look for us.
What on earth are you going to do in Gar Og Nadrak? Poren asked curiously. Belgarath looked suggestively at the walls behind which the official spies, as well as a few unofficial ones, lurked.
Polgara will know what we're doing. What's the current situation along the Nadrak border?
Tense, she replied. It's not hostile yet, but it's a long way from cordial. The Nadraks don't really want to go to war. If it weren't for the Grolims, I honestly think we could persuade them to stay neutral. They'd much rather kill Murgos than Drasnians. The Nadraks are interesting. Belgarath nodded.
Pass the word on to your husband that I'd like him to keep a fairly tight rein on Anheg, he continued. Anheg's brilliant, but he's a trifle erratic at times. Rodar's steadier. Tell him that what I want in the south is a diversion, not a general war. Alorns sometimes get over-enthusiastic.
I'll get word to him, Poren promised. When will you start?
Let's leave that a bit tentative.
The old man glanced once again at the walls of the Queen's room. You'll stay the night at least, she insisted. How could we possibly refuse? Silk asked mockingly. Queen Poren looked at him for a long moment. Then she sighed. I guess I should tell you, Keldar, she said very quietly. Your mother's here. Silk's face blanched. Here? In the palace? The Queen nodded. She's in the West Wing. I've given her that apartment near the garden she loves so much. Silk's hands had begun to tremble visibly, and his face was still ashen. How long has she been here? He asked in a strained voice. Several weeks. She came before the baby was born. How is she? The same. The little blonde queen's voice was hushed with sadness. You'll have to see her, you know. Silk drew in a deep breath and squared his shoulders. His face, however, was still stricken. There's no avoiding it, I guess, he said, almost to himself. I might as well get it over with. You'll excuse me? Of course. He turned and left the room, his face somber. Doesn't he like his mother? Garion asked. He loves her very much, the Queen replied. That's why it's so terribly difficult for him. She's blind, fortunately. Fortunately? There was a pestilence in western Drasnia about 20 years ago, Poren explained. It was a horrible disease, and it left dreadful scars on the faces of the survivors. Prince Keldar's mother had been one of the most beautiful women in Drasnia. We've concealed the truth from her. She doesn't realize how disfigured her face is. At least, we hope she doesn't. The meetings between Keldar and his mother are heartbreaking. There's no hint in his voice of what he sees, but his eyes. She broke off. Sometimes I think that's why he stays away from Drasnia, she added. Then she straightened. I'll ring for supper, she said, and something to drink. Keldar usually needs that after he's visited with his mother. It was an hour or more before Silk returned, and he immediately started drinking. He drank grimly, like a man bent on reducing himself to unconsciousness as quickly as possible. It was an uncomfortable evening for Garion. We've already stamped that. Queen Poren cared for her infant son, even while keeping a watchful eye on Silk. Belgarath sat silently in a chair, and Silk kept drinking. Finally, pretending a weariness he did not feel, Garion went to bed. He drank bardically. He had not realized how much he had depended on Silk in the year and a half he had known him. Year and a half. Garion went from scullery boy to super king in a year and a half. The rat-faced little Drasnian's sardonic humor and towering self-reliance had always been something to cling to. To be sure, Silk had his quirks and peculiarities. He was a high-strung, complex little man, but his unfailing sense of humor and his mental agility had seen them all through some very unpleasant situations. Now, however, all traces of humor and wit were gone, and the little man seemed on the verge of total collapse. That's a thing. That's always a weird thing in D&D. The leveling up. Bardley Brew. The way that you level up in D&D, like, so frequently, especially if you've got a really dense timeline for your adventures where it's just one thing after another. And so, you start out at level 1, and then it's like a week later, you're like level 5 or 6. If you're adventuring all day, every day. I mean, maybe that's an extreme case, but sometimes it feels like adventuring characters gain power so rapidly in D&D that it kind of breaks the narrative a little bit, especially when then, like, if an NPC gets introduced who's been adventuring for years and they're level 3 or 5 or whatever, and you're like, oh, I got to I got to level 5 in like, half a month. Yeah, anyways, I don't know. Sometimes it just doesn't hold up narratively. Like, you have to have a sort of subtext of the player characters are the chosen ones. Even if nobody treats them like it or anything, there's something special about player characters that lets them gain immense power in a very short amount of time just by stabbing a few goblins. Like, I don't know. Also talking about characters with superpowers, especially compared to farmers. Yeah, yeah. And that's definitely a thing. But it's still like sometimes it's just when you get characters that are getting to like level 10, and at level 10 you start to get very powerful, and then you look at the timeline and it's like, okay, they've been adventuring for maybe 6 months. So, and like, let's say, okay, my character is 25 years old. From when he was born until he was 20, like until he was 25, he was level 1 in that span of time. Then he hit 25 and he went on some adventures, and now he's level 10, and he can, throw fireballs and teleport and fly and I don't know, just it's something that I feel like you just need to not examine too closely, or else it can start to feel really weird. Anyways, I digress. The little man seemed on the verge of total collapse. The dreadful confrontation toward which they rode seemed all the more perilous now for some reason. Although Silk might not have been able to help him when he finally faced Torak, Garion had counted on his friend to assist him through the terrible days leading up to the meeting. Now even that slight comfort seemed to have been taken away. Oh, he just got really drunk one night. Chill, Garion. Unable to sleep, he tossed and turned for hours. Finally, well past midnight, he rose, pulled his cloak about him, and patted on stockinged feet to see if his friend had made it to bed. Silk had not. He still sat in the same chair. His tankard, unnoticed, had spilled, and he had sat with his elbows in a puddle of ale and his face in his hands. Not far away, her face unreadable, sat the weary little blonde Queen of Drasnia. As Garion watched from the doorway, a muffled sound came from between Silk's hands. With a gentle, almost tender expression, Queen Porén rose, came around the table, and put her arms about his head, drawing him to her. With a despairing cry, Silk clung to her, weeping openly like a hurt child. Queen Porén looked across the little man's shaking head at Garion. Her face quite clearly revealed that she was aware of Silk's feelings for her. Her look was one of helpless compassion for this man of whom she was fond, but not in the way he wished, and combined with that was a deep sympathy for the suffering his visit with his mother had caused him. Silently, Garion and the Queen of Drasnia stood looking at each other. Speech was unnecessary, they both understood. When at last Porén did speak, her tone was curiously matter-of-fact. "I think you can put him to bed now," she said. "Once he's able to cry, the worst is usually over." The next morning they left the palace and joined an eastbound caravan. The Drasnian moors beyond Boktor were desolate. The north caravan route wound through low, rolling hills covered with sparse vegetation and scanty grass. Although it was the middle of spring, there seemed to be a sere quality to the moors. I think that's sere, S-E-R-E. As if the seasons only lightly touched them. The wind, sweeping down from the polar ice, still had the smell of winter in it. Silk rode in silence, his eyes on the ground, though whether from grief or from the after-effects of the ale he had drunk, Garion could not guess. Belgarath was also quiet, and the three of them rode with only the sound of the harness bells of a Drasnian merchant's mules for companionship. About noon, Seer. Yeah, that's what I said, right? Like I said Seer. Seer. Okay. Dry or withered. With only the sound of the harness bells of a Drasnian's merchant's mules for companionship. About noon, Silk shook himself and looked around, his eyes finally alert, though still a bit bloodshot. "Did anybody think to bring something to drink?" he asked.
"Didn't you get enough last night?"
Belgarath replied. "That was for entertainment. What I need now is something therapeutic." "Water?" Garion suggested. "I'm thirsty, Garion, not dirty."
"Here."
Belgarath handed the suffering man a wineskin.
"But don't overdo it."
"Trust me," Silk said, taking a long drink. He shuddered and made a face. "Where did you buy this?" he inquired. "It tastes like somebody's been boiling old shoes in it."
"You don't have to drink it."
"I'm afraid I do." Silk took another drink, then restoppered the wineskin and handed it back. He looked sourly around at the moors. "Hasn't changed much," he observed. "Drasnia has very little to recommend it, I'm afraid. It's either too wet or too dry." He shivered in the chilly wind. "Are either of you aware of the fact that there's nothing between us and the pole to break the wind but an occasional stray reindeer?" Garion began to relax. Silk's sallies and comments grew broader and more outrageous as they rode through the afternoon. By the time the caravan stopped for the night, he seemed to be almost his old self again. That's the end of chapter 20. It sounds messy outside. Very rainy. Oh, I slept badly last night or something, and I've got a sore crick in my neck right here. It's like I can turn my head this way, and that's fine, but if I try to go this way, it's like, nope, can't do that. We don't bend that direction. Okay, Ben, you got just the hand. Boop, 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 boop. Down. Which hand's it in? That one? That one? You sure? You sure? Yeah, it's there. You went straight for it. We don't do that here, aging bodies. So frustrating when it's just something from sleep. You're like, no, sleep is supposed to be healing, not hurting. Boop, 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 boop. Which hand's it in? That one again? You sure? You sure? You sure? He's sure. Oh, it's not in that one. Oh, you chose wrong. Yeah, it's in that one. No, you gotta try again. Okay, which hand's it in? That one? You sure? You sure? Yeah, I put it there that time. Yeah. No, what are you doing? Do I need to tighten this up? There we go. So, speaking of being old people that suck at sleeping and etc., how's everyone feeling? Should I continue into chapter 21? Or do people want an early Friday night? This was a little bit of a bummer chapter, wasn't it? It was not as fun as Fenling's. A little bit more. Let's see if we can get something slightly more entertaining than being sad about your mother. Chapter 21. Before dinner naps. I don't nap well. I'm like, if I try to nap, I'm either not sleeping at all or I'm out, and then it's no longer a nap, and I'm like struggling to wake up before like 3 hours have passed. And then it throws off my sleep for that night. The caravan wound its slow way through the dreary moors of eastern Drasnia, with the sound of mule bells trailing mournfully behind it. Mule bells. I mean, I suppose bandits would probably be the worst they'd have to worry about. It just seems odd for a caravan to, like, draw attention to itself like that. Sparse patches of heath, which had but lately begun to bloom with tiny pink flowers, dotted the low, rolling hills. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Wild animals, maybe if there's a traveler that could use company, like maybe it would, but, like, and it's been a while since they've encountered bandits, but they had encountered them a few times, but that was mostly in Arendia, with the Mimbrates and the Asturians, and I feel like that's because of the break between those. You know, they had, and Arendia also had the serfs, so I think maybe banditry was just more common in Arendia, and maybe it's less common in most of the rest of the West. Maybe like maybe Drasnia just doesn't get many bandits comparatively. Alright, so the heath had but lately begun to bloom with tiny pink flowers dotted the low rolling hills. The sky had turned cloudy, and the wind, seemingly perpetual, blew steadily out of the north. Garion found his mood growing as sad and bleak as the moors around him. There was one inescapable fact which he could no longer hide from himself. Each mile, each step, brought him closer to Meloria and closer to his meeting with Torak. Even the whispered song of the orb, murmuring continually in his ears from the pommel of the greatsword strapped to his back, could not reassure him. Torak was a god, invincible, immortal, and Garion, not even yet full grown, was quite deliberately trekking to Meloria to seek him out and fight him to the death. Death was a word Garion had tried very hard not to think about. It had been a possibility once or twice during their long pursuit of Zedar and the orb, but now it seemed like a certainty. He would meet Torak alone. Mandaralin or Barak or Hetar could not come to his aid with their superior skill at swordsmanship. Belgarath or Aunt Pol could not intercede for him with sorcery. Silk would not be able to devise some clever ruse to allow him to escape. Titanic and enraged, where was I? The dark god would rush upon him, eager for blood. Garion began to fear sleep, for sleep brought nightmares which would not go away, and which haunted his days, making each worse than the last. He was afraid. The fear grew worse with each passing day until the sour taste of it was always in his mouth. More than anything, he wanted to run, but he knew that he could not. Indeed, he did not even know any place where he could run. There was no place in all the world for him to hide. Go back to the fens. The gods themselves would seek him out if he tried, and sternly drive him to that awful meeting which had been fated to take place since the beginning of time. And so it was that, sick with fear, Garion rode to meet his fate. Belgarath, who was not always asleep when he seemed to doze in his saddle, watched, shrewdly waiting until Garion's fear had reached its peak before he spoke. Then, one cloudy morning when the lead-gray sky was as dreary as the moors around them, he pulled his horse in beside Garion's.
"Do you want to talk about it?"
he asked calmly. "What's the point, Grandfather?"
"It might help."
"Nothing's going to help. He's going to kill me."
"If I thought that it was that inevitable, I wouldn't have let you start on this journey."
"How can I possibly fight with a god?"
"Bravely,"
was the unhelpful reply.
"You've been brave at some pretty inappropriate times in the past. I don't imagine you've changed all that much."
"I'm so afraid, Grandfather," Garion confessed, his voice anguished. "I think I know how Mandaralin felt now. The fear is so awful that I can't live with it."
"You're stronger than you think you are. You can live with it if you have to."
Garion brooded about that. It didn't seem to help much. "What's he like?" he asked, suddenly filled with a morbid curiosity.
"Who?"
"Torak."
"Arrogant. I never cared much for him."
"Is he like Ktuchik was? Or Asherak?"
"No. They tried to be like him. They didn't succeed, of course, but they tried. If it's any help to you, Torak's probably as much afraid of you as you are of him. He knows who you are. When you meet him, he isn't going to see a Sendarian scullery boy named Garion. He's going to see Belgarion, the Revan King, and he's going to see Reva's sword thirsting for his blood. He's also going to see the Orb of Aldor, and that will probably frighten him more than anything."
"When was the first time you met him?" Garion suddenly wanted the old man to talk, to tell stories as he had so long ago. Stories somehow always helped. He could lose himself in a story, and for a little while it might make things bearable. Belgarath scratched at his short white beard.
"Let's see,"
He mused. "You know, that took a lot longer than I expected it to." "Oh, what? We already got that one?" "Oh, never mind. I thought that we hadn't gotten it yet." "No, sorry everyone. It's already done." I forgot that we'd already done that. Is there anything else on here that has come up? We had mention of Mandaralin. Still fun. But no, not really. Yeah, I don't think anything else has really come up. Alright. Belgarath scratched at his short white beard.
"Let's see,"
He mused.
"I think the first time was in the Vale. It was a very long time ago. The others had gathered there, Belzadar, Beldin, all the rest, and each of us was involved in his own studies. Our master had withdrawn into his tower with the orb, and sometimes months would pass during which we didn't see him. Then, one day, a stranger came to us. He seemed to be about the same height as I, but he walked as if he were 1,000 feet tall. His hair was black, and his skin was very pale, and he had, as I remember, greenish-colored eyes. His face was beautiful to the point of being pretty, and his hair looked as if he spent a lot of time combing it. He appeared to be the kind of person who always has a mirror in his pocket.
Remember, this book is from the 80s. An evil Bishonen. I wonder when exactly this book was published. Because the first ones were like early 80s, but I don't know how far, like how long it took for the sequels to come out. It says copyright 1984 by David Eddings. Yeah. It says 1984. Anyways, my point is, Torak had a mirror in his pocket before Shania Twain sang about it.
He appeared to be the kind of person who always has a mirror in his pocket.
Did he say anything? Yours says 1984, yeah. Did he say anything? Garion asked.
Oh, yes,
Belgarath replied.
He came up to us and said, I would speak with my brother, thy master. And I definitely didn't care for his tone. He spoke as if we were servants. It's a failing he's always had. Still, my master had, after a great deal of trouble, taught me at least a few manners.
I shall tell my master you have come,
I told him as politely as I could manage.
I'm sorry, I had to.
That is not needful, Belgarath, he told me, and in that irritatingly superior tone of his. My brother knows I am here.
How did he know your name, grandfather? Belgarath shrugged.
I never found that out. I assumed that my master had communicated with him, and the other gods, from time to time, and told them about us. At any rate, I led this over-pretty visitor to my master's tower. I didn't bother to speak to him along the way. When we got there, he looked me straight in the face and said, A bit of advice for thee, Belgarath, by way of thanks for thy service. Seek not to rise above thyself. It is not thy place to approve or disapprove of me. For thy sake, I hope that when next we meet, thou wilt remember this and behave in a manner more seemly. Thank you for the advice, I told him, a bit tartly, I'll admit. Will you require anything else? Thou art pert, Belgarath, he said to me. Perhaps one day I shall give myself leisure to instruct thee in proper behavior. And then he went into the tower. As you can see, Torak and I got off on the wrong foot right at the very beginning. I didn't care for his attitude, and he didn't care for mine. What happened then? Garion's curiosity had begun to quiet the fear somewhat. You know the story, Belgarath replied. Torak went up into the tower and spoke with Aldur. One thing led to another, and finally Torak struck my master and stole the orb. The old man's face was bleak. The next time I saw him, he wasn't nearly so pretty, he continued with a certain grim satisfaction. That was after the orb had burned him and he'd taken to wearing a steel mask to hide the ruins of his face. Silk had drawn closer and was riding with them, fascinated by the story. What did you all do then? After Torak stole the orb, I mean, he asked. Our master sent us to warn the other gods, Belgarath replied. I was supposed to find Belar. He was in the north someplace, carousing with his Alorns. Belar was a young god at that time, and he enjoyed the diversions of the young. Alorn girls used to dream about being visited by him, and he tried to make as many dreams come true as he possibly could, or so I've been told."
"I've never heard that about him." Silk seemed startled.
"Perhaps it's only gossip,"
Belgarath admitted. "Did you find him?" Garion asked.
"It took me quite a while. The shape of the land was different then. What's now Algaria stretched all the way to the east. Thousands of leagues of open grassland. At first I took the shape of an eagle, but that didn't work out too well."
"It seems quite suitable," Silk observed.
"Heights make me giddy,"
the old man replied.
"and my eyes were continually getting distracted by things on the ground. I kept having this overpowering urge to swoop down and kill things. The character of the forms we assume begins to dominate our thinking after a while, and although the eagle is quite splendid looking, he's really a very stupid bird. Finally, I gave that idea up and chose the form of the wolf instead. It worked out much better. About the only distraction I encountered was a young she-wolf who was feeling frolicsome."
There was a slight tightening about his eyes as he said it, and his voice had a peculiar catch in it.
"Belgarath!"
Silk actually sounded shocked.
"Don't be so quick to jump to conclusions, Silk. I considered the morality of the situation. I realized that being a father is probably all well and good, but that a litter of puppies might prove embarrassing later on. I resisted her advances, even though she persisted in following me all the way to the north, where the bear god dwelt with his Alorns."
He broke off and looked out at the gray-green moors, his face unreadable. Frolicsome is a great word. Garion knew that there was something the old man wasn't saying. Something important.
"Anyway,"
Belgarath continued,
"Belar accompanied us back to the Vale where the other gods had gathered, and they held a council and decided that they'd have to make war on Torak and his Angarax." That was the start of it all. The world has never been the same since.
"What happened to the wolf?" Garion asked, trying to pin down his grandfather's peculiar evasion.
"She stayed with me,"
Belgarath replied calmly.
"She used to sit for days on end in my tower watching me. She had a curious turn of mind, and her comments were frequently a trifle disconcerting."
"Comments?" Silk asked. "She could talk?"
"In the manner of the wolf, you understand. I'd learned how they speak during our journey together. It's really a rather concise and often quite beautiful language. Wolves can be eloquent, even poetic, once you get used to having them speak to you without words."
"How long did she stay with you?" Garion asked.
"Quite a long time,"
Belgarath replied.
"I remember that I asked her about that once. She answered with another question. It was an irritating habit of hers. She just said,
'What is time to a wolf?'
I made a few calculations and found out that she'd been with me for just over 1,000 years. I was a bit amazed by that, but she seemed indifferent to the fact.
'Wolves live as long as they choose to live,'
was all she said. Then, one day I had to change my form for some reason or other. I forget exactly why. She saw me do it, and that was the end of any peace for me. She just said, 'So that's how you do it,' and promptly changed herself into a snowy owl. She seemed to take a great delight in startling me, and I never knew what shape I'd see when I turned around. She was fondest of the owl, though. A few years after that she left me. I was rather surprised to find that I missed her. We'd been together for a very long time."
He broke off, and once again he looked away. Did you ever see her again? Garion wanted to know. Belgarath nodded.
She saw to that, though I didn't know it at the time. I was running an errand for my master somewhere to the north of the Vale, and I came across a small, neatly thatched cottage in a grove of trees by a small river. A woman named Poledra lived in the cottage, a woman with tawny hair and curiously golden eyes. We grew to know each other, and eventually we were married. She was Polgara's mother, and Beldaran's.
You were saying that you met the wolf again, Garion reminded him.
You don't listen too well, Garion,
the old man said, looking directly at his grandson. There was a deep and ancient injury in his eyes, a hurt so great that Garion knew it would be there for as long as the old man lived. You don't mean...
It took me a while to accept it myself, actually. Poledra was very patient and very determined. When she found out that I couldn't accept her as a mate in the form of a wolf, she simply found a different shape. She got what she wanted in the end.
He sighed. Aunt Pol's mother was a wolf? Garion was stunned.
No, Garion,
Belgarath replied calmly.
She was a woman, a very lovely woman. The change of shape is absolute.
But she started out as a wolf?
So?
But the whole notion was somehow shocking.
Don't let your prejudices run away with you,
Belgarath told him. Garion struggled with the idea. It seemed monstrous somehow. I'm sorry, he said finally. It's unnatural, no matter what you say.
Garion,
the old man reminded him with a pained look.
Just about everything we do is unnatural. Moving rocks with your mind isn't the most natural thing in the world if you stop and think about it.
But this is different, Garion protested. Grandfather, you married a wolf, and the wolf had children. How could you do that? Belgarath sighed and shook his head.
You're a very stubborn boy, Garion, he observed. It seems that you're never going to understand until you've been through the experience. Let's go over behind that hill, and I'll show you.
This sounds wrong. He's talking about the shape changing. The phrasing here is awkward.
Let's go over behind that hill, and I'll show you how it's done. There's no point in upsetting the rest of the caravan.
Mind if I come along? Silk asked, his nose twitching with curiosity.
Might not be a bad idea.
Belgarath agreed.
You can hold the horses. Horses tend to panic in the presence of wolves.
They rode away from the caravan track under the leaden sky and circled around behind a low, heath-covered hill.
This should do,
Belgarath decided, reining in and dismounting in a shallow swale. I feel like that's the second time that word's come up. S-W-A-L-E. Shallow swale just behind the hill. The swale was covered with new grass, green with spring.
The whole trick is to create the image of the animal in your mind,
Belgarath explained,
down to the last detail. Then you direct your will inward, upon yourself, and then change, fitting yourself into the image.
Garion frowned, not understanding.
It's going to take too long if I have to explain it in words, Belgarath said. Here, watch, and watch with your mind as well as your eyes.
Unbidden, the shape of the great grey wolf he had seen on occasion before came into Garion's mind. He could clearly see the grey-shot muzzle and the silver ruff. Then he felt the surge and heard the hollow roaring sound in his mind. For an instant, The image of the wolf curiously mingled with the image of Belgarath himself, as if the two were trying to both occupy the same space. Everybody here has seen a, what's it called? Animorphs. An Animorphs cover. I don't think this is exactly how this goes. Because this is more like, there's Belgarath and a wolf, and then it says, then Belgarath was gone, and only the wolf remained. Or a howling goose. That sounds like the name of an army squadron. The Howling Geese. Not a very good one. Yeah, maybe. One fades in and the other fades out. Or a pub. The Howling Goose Inn. Alright, let's see. Silk whistled, then took a firmer grip on the reins of their startled horses. Belgarath changed back again to an ordinary-looking old man in a rust-brown tunic and grey hooded cloak.
Do you understand?
He asked Garion. I think so, Garion replied, a bit dubiously.
Try it. I'll lead you through it one step at a time.
Garion started to put a wolf together in his mind.
Don't forget the toenails, Belgarath told him. They may not look like much, but they're very important.
Garion put the toenails in.
Tail's too short.
Garion fixed that.
That's about right. Now fit yourself into it.
Garion put his will to it. Change, he said. It seemed almost as if his body had grown somehow fluid, shifting, altering, flowing into the image of the wolf that he had in his mind. When the surge was gone, he sat on his haunches, panting. He felt very strange.
Stand up and let's have a look at you,
Belgarath told him. Garion rose and stood on all four paws. His tail felt extremely peculiar.
You made the hind legs a bit too long,
Belgarath noted critically. Garion started to object that it was the first time he'd ever done it, but his voice came out in a peculiar series of whines and yelps.
Stop that,
Belgarath growled.
You sound like a puppy. Change back.
Garion did that. Where do your clothes go? Silk asked curiously. Good question, Silk.
They're with us,
Belgarath replied.
But at the same time, they're not. It's kind of hard to explain, actually. Belden tried to work out exactly where the clothes were once. He seems to think he's got the answer, but I never understood the whole theory. Belden's quite a bit more intelligent than I am, and his explanations are sometimes a bit exotic.
I think Belden was the hunchback, the really nasty, insulting one. I think. Because otherwise there was the twins. I think those are the only ones we've met. I'm fairly sure Belden was the hunchback.
At any rate, when we return to our original shape, our clothing is always just as it was.
Even Garion's sword? Silk asked. And the orb? The old man nodded. Isn't it sort of dangerous having it floating around out there, unattached, so to speak?
It isn't really unattached. It's still there, but at the same time it's not.
I'll take your word for it, Silk conceded dubiously.
Try it again, Garion,
Belgarath suggested. Very important. Garion switched back and forth several times until his wolf shape satisfied his grandfather.
Stay with the horses,
the old man told Silk.
We'll be back in a little bit.
He flickered and shimmered into the great grey wolf.
Let's run for a bit,
he said to Garion. The meaning of what he said was conveyed directly from his mind to Garion's, aided only slightly by expressions and positions of his head and ears and a few brief barking sounds. Garion suddenly understood why the bond of the pack was so strong in wolves. Quite literally, they inhabited each other's minds. What one saw, they all saw, and what one felt, they all felt. "Where do we run to?" Garion asked, not really surprised at how easily the speech of wolves came to him.
"No place in particular. I just need to stretch out a few kinks."
And the gray wolf bounded away with astonishing speed. The tail was a definite problem at first. Garion kept forgetting that it was there, and its swishing back and forth kept jerking him off balance. By the time he got the hang of it, the old wolf was far out ahead of him on the gray-green moors. After a while, however, Garion found himself literally flying across the ground. His paws scarcely seemed to touch the earth as he bunched and stretched his body in great bounds. He marveled at the economy of the running gait of the wolf. He ran not with his legs alone, but with his entire body. He became quite certain that, if need be, he could run for days without tiring. The rolling moors were different somehow. What had seemed as desolate and empty as the dead sky overhead was suddenly teeming with life. There were mice and burrowing squirrels. In scrubby brown thickets, rabbits, petrified with fright, watched him as he loped by with his toenails digging into the springy turf. Silently he exulted in the strength and freedom of his new body. He was the lord of the plain, and all creatures gave way to him. And then he was not alone. Another wolf ran beside him, a strangely insubstantial-looking wolf that seemed to have a bluish, flickering light playing about her. "And how far will you run?" she asked him in the manner of wolves. "We can stop if you'd like," Garion replied politely, dropping back into a lope and then into a trot. "It's easier to talk if one isn't running," she agreed. She stopped and dropped to her haunches. Garion also stopped. "You're Poledra, aren't you?" He asked it very directly, not yet accustomed to the subtleties of the language of wolves. "Wolves have no need of names," she sniffed. "He used to worry about that, too." It was not exactly like the voice that had been in his mind since his childhood. He didn't actually hear her, but instead he seemed to know exactly what she wanted to say to him. "Grandfather, you mean?" "Who else? Men seem to have a need to classify things and put names on them. I think they overlook some very important things that way." "How is it that you're here? Aren't you, well, dead, you mean? Don't be afraid of the word. It's only a word, after all. I suppose I am, though. It doesn't really feel all that much different." "Doesn't somebody have to do something to bring you back?" he asked. "Like what Aunt Pole did at that time when we were fighting with Gruul in the mountains of Ulgo?" "It's not entirely necessary. I can be summoned that way, but I can manage it myself if I have to." She looked at him quizzically. "You're really confused by all of this, aren't you?" "All of what?" "Everything. Who you are, who we are, what you have to do." "A little," he admitted. "Let me see if I can explain it. Take him, for instance. I never really saw him as a man, you know. There's something decidedly wolfish about him. I always rather thought that his being born in man shape had been a mistake of some kind. Maybe it was because of what he had to do. The shape doesn't really matter, though." "It doesn't? Did you really think it did?" She almost seemed to laugh. "Here, let me show you. Let's change." She shimmered into air, and was standing before him then in the form of a tawny-haired woman with golden eyes. Her gown was very plain and brown. Garion shrugged himself back into his natural form. "Am I really any different, Belgarion?" she asked him. "Am I not who I am, whether as wolf or owl or woman?" And then he understood. "May I call you grandmother?" he asked her, a bit embarrassed. "If it makes you happy," she replied. "It's a bit inaccurate, though." "I know," he said, "but I feel a little more comfortable with it." "Have you finally accepted who you are?" "I don't have much choice, do I?" "But you're afraid of it and what you have to do, is that it?" He nodded mutely. "You're not going to be alone, you know." He looked at her sharply. "I thought the Codex said—" "The Codex doesn't really say everything that's involved," she told him. "Your meeting with Torak will be the coming together of two enormous opposing forces. The two of you are really just the representatives of those forces. There'll be so much power involved in your meeting that you and Torak will be almost incidental to what's really happening." "Why couldn't somebody else do it then?" he asked quickly. "Somebody better suited to it." "I said almost incidental," she said firmly. "It has to be you, and it's always been Torak. You are the channels through which the forces will collide. When it happens, I think you'll be surprised at how easy it all is." "Am I going to win?" "I don't know. The universe itself doesn't know. That's why you have to meet him. If we knew how it would turn out, the meeting wouldn't be necessary." She looked around. "Belgarath's coming back. I'll have to leave you now." "Why?" "My presence pains him, more than you could ever know." "Because—" He broke off, not knowing how to say it. "We were closer than others, and we were together for a very long time. Sometimes I wish that he could understand that we haven't really been separated, but perhaps it's too early." "It's been 3,000 years, grandmother." "What is time to a wolf?" she asked cryptically. Okay, so if that's accurate, then that means Polgara is around 3,000 years old. "What is time to a wolf?" she asked cryptically. "The mating of wolves is permanent, and the grief caused by separation is also permanent. Perhaps someday—" Her voice trailed off wistfully, and then she sighed. "As soon as I leave, change back again. Belgarath will want you to hunt with him. It's sort of a formality. You'll understand when you're back in the shape of a wolf." Garion nodded and began to form the image of the wolf in his mind. "One other thing, Belgarion." "Yes, grandmother?" "I do love you, you know." "I love you too, grandmother." And then she was gone. Garion sighed and changed himself back into a wolf. And then he went out from that place to join Belgarath in the hunt. This is new. Part 4, The Raven Queen. I think this is the first part that has not been like the name of a country. Or kingdom or whatever. The Raven Queen. And the map is back to Arendia and the Sea of the Winds. Which maybe is also the first time we've had a duplicate map. I don't know if it's exactly the map that we had before when it was the like Arendia part, or if it's like a slightly expanded one. Well, you like it when it jumps to Sinedra's perspective? Based on the title of the next part, we might get a bit of that. So that was a not more interesting, but a less bleak chapter anyways, than the one before. a good bit of history, some details on how shape changing works. Belgarath's comment about the change is complete, like the change is total or absolute, whatever he said, is interesting because it's not like there's a time limit on it, right? You don't change into an animal and then within X amount of time you automatically change back, or, it's if you change into a wolf, you are now a wolf. That's it. You're still, Garion or whoever, but you are Garion the wolf. And you're not Garion the human until you choose to change back into a human. Also interesting, Poledra's whole, she was originally a wolf, and then she saw him shape change one day, and she was like, oh, I can do that. Alright, well. Bear was streaming, but it looks like he has stopped, so I don't see anyone on my list doing that. Yeah, so we've got a wolf sorceress, yeah, something like that. We've got an open house this weekend, and it might be very busy. Hopefully, fingers crossed, wish us luck that it's very busy, but we're not going to be at home for that. Depending on how things go with that, that might affect whether or not the stream happens as normal next week. But tentatively, my plan is to be back here next Wednesday as normal. If anything comes up, I'll try to let you know ahead of time. But, wish us luck. Fingers crossed. But yeah, we've got some tidying up to do. Not a lot, but we've got some tidying up to do, and then we're heading out tomorrow morning. So, hopefully everyone enjoyed those chapters. I mean, we got... The bit with Silk's mom was sad. I feel like it's kind of an incomplete story at this point. We don't have all the details. But we got some more backstory for Silk. It's been quite a while since we got anything further about his history. And we got some more history of Belgarath, and yeah, some interesting stuff there. Alright, well, have a good weekend, everyone. Yeah, and hopefully I'll see you next Wednesday, and if I don't, hopefully it's because we've had some luck with selling our house. Not that we should be out of here immediately in case that happens, but, Alright. Good night. Bye-bye. I'm gonna wrap things up. See you next week.